What is it that you fear the most? Is it the dark? Or is it something that waits in the dark? Something so perfect in its evil that it has remained unchanged since the beginning of time. Something that has no fear of man. Something out there, waiting for the light to fade.
Those ads have been saturating television for the past 2 years.
To put it bluntly, what you see in most of these films is a lot of teenage girls.
Say, but why shouldn't adults be able to see this kind of thing?
It keeps motion picture free, too, to continue its amazing artistic
Toys that say if a girl is at home alone,
You want
menacing
entertainment.
attacker, the ringing television for the past 2 years. And the summer and fall of 1980 are the worst yet.
Of all the types of movies produced by Hollywood, there isn't one with the cards stacked against it like the horror movie. Over the years, the genre has been fighting an uphill battle to be taken as seriously as some of the more esteemed drama, war, or romance films that dominate award season. Horror movies have also come across rampant censorship due to the levels of graphic violence and nudity on display, particularly starting when the Hays Code took hold in 1934. The code didn't necessarily target horror specifically, but it damaged the genre the most. The Hays Code disallowed profanity.
In the name of God, now I know what it feels like to be God.
White slavery, ridicule of the clergy,
You know what it means to feel like God.
and any inference of sex perversion. While apparent cruelty to children, sympathy for criminals, man and woman in bed together, and deliberate seduction of girls were also frowned upon. The greatest and most iconic horror films of the Golden Age were released before the Hays Code, and included scenes that cover all the topics previously mentioned.
Listen to them, children of the night. What music they make.
But the dark and macabre content of the old dark house-style horror films would die out before the end of the 30s. And while there were good horror films through the 40s and 50s, giant monsters and atomic energy plagued horror films of this era. Thankfully, by the late 60s, the genre had gotten the shot in the arm it needed after the elimination of the Hays Code and the introduction of the MPAA, which has its own problems, but finally more adult topics were allowed to make their way back into the films. I find it quite fitting that Night of the Living Dead would be one of the last films released in the old Hollywood general audience type banner, considering the graphic violence on display, which was very shocking for the time. Night of the Living Dead resonated with the public due to its palpable cynicism. This bleak outlook on display, driven from a rather tumultuous time in America, would inspire a new generation of filmmakers through the 70s to the early 80s. Legendary horror directors Wes Craven, John Carpenter, Brian De Palma, Tobe Hooper, Sam Raimi, and David Cronenberg came into their own in the next few decades. Now let's look at it this way. There's horror before Night of the Living Dead, and then there's horror afterwards. And without Night of the Living Dead, you don't get Texas Chainsaw Massacre, you don't get Halloween, and you don't get The Evil Dead. The film's director, George A. Romero, wouldn't stop there though. In 1978, Dawn of the Dead was released, which with the help of Tom Savini, would push the graphic violence even further. Makeup artists like Tom Savini, Dick Smith, Rick Baker, Rob Bottin, and Stan Winston would not only create the graphic violence on display in the movies of the 70s and 80s, but the creepy creatures that had taken on a new level of realism. I mean, some of these effects just straight up look real. And maybe they look a little too real. You can sort of look at the reaction film critics like Siskel and Ebert had to the slasher boom of the early 80s and see just how effective the violence in these films were.
And all of these films are thrillers featuring extreme violence directed at young women. To put it bluntly, what you see in most of these films is a lot of teenage girls being raped or stabbed to death, usually both. Rather than just, you know, if you want to see twice ground beef, go to a butcher shop. I don't know if I want to see that in a movie theater.
They're not very proud of this movie, and maybe they shouldn't be very proud of this movie, but they sure are advertising it heavily.
Yeah, when the machete went into the head of the kid in the wheelchair, that's about when I gave up on the picture.
The movie is so cynical. It's simply a series of mutilations and murders.
I said, well, let's see, maybe they'll go another way. Maybe they won't have anybody killed. Wouldn't that be clever? Wouldn't that be challenging, fresh? No, bang, bang, bang.
But it wasn't just the film critics stomping profusely on the horror genre during this time. Plenty of horror films were just straight up banned in certain countries. They could literally confiscate your physical copy of certain films and destroy it in places like England. Angry moms got certain movies pulled out of circulation. A more specific example being Silent Night, Deadly Night getting pulled early due to angry parents finding the ads unacceptable. Santa Claus can't be a killer, even though it's not really Santa, it's just a guy dressed as Santa, and nobody had a problem with this before in other movies. Pearl clutching. The critics really slammed some great movies during this time too, the most infamous example being John Carpenter's The Thing getting eviscerated for weeks while everybody stayed writing E.T. like it's the greatest movie ever made. The graphic violence in slasher films and other films like Evil Dead would be heavily criticized for its violence against women. Yes, I suppose violence against women is in somewhat bad taste. Yeah, we want to keep the women safe, don't we?
To put it bluntly, what you see in most of these films is a lot of teenage girls being raped or stabbed to death, usually both.
You want to know what's definitely not keeping them safe though? Literally doxing them. Yeah, Gene Siskel literally doxed Betsy Palmer in his review of the first Friday the 13th movie. It's in the article. They just got her address in the article. Go and send her some hate mail. It's a bunch of psychopaths. It's a lunatic. I'm all for hearing other people's opinions and stuff. I don't think the first Friday is all that great either. But these guys are acting like they were on some type of moral crusade. Like they reviewed movies for a living. Like, sheesh, calm down. And they don't like Mark Hamill's interpretation of the Joker, so fuck them.
In the cartoon show on TV. I don't like this Joker's voice.
You're too late, Batman! There are 20 miles of tunnels under this place, and they're all filled with high explosives.
And if the critics and angry parents weren't enough, the MPAA would get a tight stranglehold on the horror genre by the mid-80s. Here's John Landis explaining some of the issues he's had with the MPAA when getting his film reviewed.
Very few people realize this, but the United States is the only country in the world that does not have government-imposed censorship. We have a self-regulating board of the Motion Picture Association of America whose job is to reflect the current mores. For instance, I made a movie called Kentucky Fried Movie, which was 5 years ago. They had a scene of lovemaking where the girl was on top, and it was fairly graphic, and that got an R rating. Now, with the moral majority and equally despicable groups screaming, an identical scene in American Werewolf in a porno movie projected on a screen was considered enough to get me an X. It was the same shot. And when I said, well, wait a minute, what are you talking about? They explained it to me, and they're correct. They're saying our job is to reflect the mores of the time, which means President Reagan is president, which means violence, in fact, is okay, and sexuality is evil and corrupt. It's sick.
I kind of get it. What audiences can handle at certain points in time changes drastically, and horror is not a friendly genre to the faint of heart. Horror films dabble in death, mental illness, physical deformities, bullying, rape, murder, pedophilia, and many more controversial and morbid topics. When you go to a theater to watch a horror movie, you're expecting to be uncomfortable, but the films of this era did push things pretty far. The MPAA had taken things a bit too far in their own right though, cutting the graphic violence out of movies to the point of confusion. If you remember my last video explaining my distaste for the cut version of My Bloody Valentine, you'd understand where I'm coming from. Film series like Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street were in constant battles with the MPAA to keep portions of the film intact. And filmmakers are resourceful, however, and this resulted in many studios producing direct-to-video horror films. The creators of Reanimator, Brian Yuzna and Stuart Gordon, straight up released it unrated. That film would have had no business in the hands of the MPAA. and Hollywood titan Steven Spielberg would invent an entirely new rating, PG-13, as a result of angry parents going to see certain movies produced by his studio, Amblin Entertainment, that might have just gone a little bit too far for PG, but weren't realistically intense enough to be rated R. The 80s had established a whole new group of iconic films and characters, but by the 90s, the genre had taken a hit. Most people were burnt out on horror, much like how people are burnt out on superheroes today. Horror started to take a more elegant and self-referential look, with a level of violence, sex, and disturbing material maintained. Ironically, a film in which the main antagonists are a cannibal and a serial killer building a suit out of human skin gets the Academy Award, which was not common. The Exorcist being the only other horror film to gain that kind of respect at the Academy. It would take another couple of decades for the Academy to start awarding horror films more consistently. It's literally within the past few years. Jordan Peele's Get Out was a commercial and critical success and received many nominations, including Best Picture, at the Academy Awards. The Shape of Water actually won that year, and even though it's not really a horror film, it's definitely inspired by the original Creature from the Black Lagoon movie, as well as the Korean horror film Parasite, which was also the first non-English speaking film to win Best Picture. It may annoy some people that elevated horror is what's getting the most critical praise right now, and they may yearn for a time when the more striking and in-your-face horror of the 80s was on top of the game. But I think it's quite fitting for horror films to be used in the way they are today. In the modern film landscape, studios tend to favor IP-driven films or just superheroes. Mid-budget films have basically died out and dried up, and that leaves horror in this interesting position. Despite all the attacks on the genre that it's taken over the years, they never stopped being made. Mainstream audiences will always go to see horror films despite their lack of recognizable characters or IPs or anything like that. Horror is a commonly low-risk and high-return venture, which is why burgeoning filmmakers almost always start out doing horror films to break into the industry. It's a genre that allows you to discuss dark subject matter in a digestible way that may offend, but also allow us to confront social issues and fears. It's why elevated horror is so popular now. It's the only type of film made in any abundance that can do that without turning off the audience. Movie audiences will always pay to see horror films, even if Rotten Tomatoes downvotes it to oblivion. It's always been a serious backbone in Hollywood, and that's why despite all the different hurdles that the genre has gone through, horror is always going to be king.
We must all get ready now.